The Navy was building for the future, while the future was already leaving the harbor. After the Second Barbary War Aegean anti-piracy ops, Mexican-American War First Sumatran Expedition, Perry's Japan mission, the Navy proved its reach. Victory won funding and a shipbuilding boom, but big, costly vessels sat half-finished in yards, waiting for a war that never came. Frigates and sloops stayed the backbone while steam engines and shell guns crept in behind Britain and France. Crews were often foreign-born or society's cast-offs. Racial bands were ignored when manpower ran thin. Ready for the next era, but not quite there.
Younger than the Army ditched flogging in 1812. The Navy held on until 1850. By 1815, the U.S. was done being bullied in the Mediterranean. Congress sent Decatur and Bainbridge with powerful squadrons. They captured the Algerian flagship Mashuda and the brig Estedio. By June, they forced the day into peace. Freed prisoners returned ships no more tribute and the right to trade. A swift, decisive campaign that reshaped American naval power.
Another international problem was the slave trade, and the African Squadron was formed in 1820 to deal with this threat. Politically, the suppression of the slave trade was unpopular, and the squadron was withdrawn in 1823, ostensibly to deal with piracy in the Caribbean, and did not return to the African coast until the passage of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty with Britain in 1842. After the treaty was passed, the United States used fewer ships than the treaty required, ordered the ships based far from the coast of Africa, and used ships that were too large to operate close to shore. Between 1845 and 1850, the United States Navy captured only 10 slave vessels, while the British captured 423 vessels, carrying 27,000 captives.
Congress formally authorized the establishment of the United States Military Academy in 1802, but it took almost 50 years to approve a similar school for naval officers. During the long period of peace between 1815 and 1846, midshipmen had few opportunities for promotion, and their warrants were often obtained via patronage. The poor quality of officer training in the U.S. Navy became visible after the Somers Affair, an alleged mutiny aboard the training ship USS Somers in 1842, and the subsequent execution of midshipman Philip Spencer. George Bancroft, appointed Secretary of the Navy in 1845, decided to work outside of congressional approval and create a new academy for officers. He formed a council led by Commodore Matthew Perry to create a new system for training officers and turn the old Fort Severn at Annapolis into a new institution in 1845, which would be designated as the United States Naval Academy by Congress in 1851. Naval forces participated in the effort to forcibly move the Seminole Indians from Florida to a reservation west of the Mississippi. After a massacre of Army soldiers near Tampa on December 28, 1835, Marines and sailors were added to the forces which fought the Second Seminole War from 1836 until 1842. A Mosquito fleet was formed in the Everglades out of various small craft to transport a mixture of Army and Navy personnel to pursue the Seminoles into the swamps. About 1,500 soldiers were killed during the conflict. Some Seminoles agreed to move, but a small group of Seminoles remained in control of the Everglades and the area around Lake Okeechobee.
The Navy played a role in two major operations of the Mexican-American War, 1845 to 1848. During the Battle of Veracruz, it transported the invasion force that captured Veracruz by landing 12,000 troops and their equipment in one day, leading eventually to the capture of Mexico City and the end of the war. Its Pacific Squadron's ships facilitated the capture of California. In 1853, Perry led the Perry Expedition, a squadron of 4 ships which sailed to Japan to establish normal relations with Japan. Perry's 2 technologically advanced steam-powered ships and calm, firm diplomacy convinced Japan to end 3 centuries of isolation and sign the Treaty of Kanagawa with the U.S. in 1854. Nominally a treaty of friendship, the agreement soon paved the way for the opening of Japan and normal trade relations with the United States and Europe.
American Civil War.
1861 to 1865. Main articles: List of naval battles of the American Civil War, Union blockade, Union Navy, and Confederate States Navy. Between the beginning of the war and the end of 1861, 373 commissioned officers, warrant officers, and midshipmen resigned or were dismissed from the United States Navy and went on to serve the Confederacy. On April 20, 1861, the Union burned its ships that were at the Norfolk Navy Yard to prevent their capture by the Confederates, but not all of the ships were completely destroyed. The screw frigate USS Merrimac was so hastily scuttled that her hull and steam engine were basically intact, which gave the South's Stephen Mallory the idea of raising her and then armoring the upper sides with iron plate. The resulting ship was named CSS Virginia. Meanwhile, John Erickson had similar ideas and received funding to build USS Monitor. Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the U.S. Army at the beginning of the war, devised the Anaconda Plan to win the war with as little bloodshed as possible. His idea was that a Union blockade of the main ports would weaken the Confederate economy. Then the capture of the Mississippi River would split the South. Lincoln adopted the plan in terms of a blockade to squeeze to death the Confederate economy, but overruled Scott's warnings that his new army was not ready for an offensive operation because public opinion demanded an immediate attack.
On March 8, 1862, the Confederate Navy initiated the first combat between ironclads when Virginia successfully attacked the blockade. The next day, Monitor engaged Virginia in the Battle of Hampton Roads. Their battle ended in a draw, and the Confederacy later lost Virginia when the ship was scuttled to prevent capture. Monitor was the prototype for the Monitor warship, and many more were built by the Union Navy. While the Confederacy built more ironclad ships during the war, they lacked the ability to build or purchase ships that could effectively counter the Monitors.
Along with ironclad ships, the new technologies of naval mines, which were known as torpedoes after the torpedo eel, and submarine warfare were introduced during the war by the Confederacy. During the Battle of Mobile Bay, mines were used to protect the harbor and sank the Union monitor USS Tecumseh. After Tecumseh sank, Admiral David G. Farragut famously said, "Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead!" The forerunner of the modern submarine, CSS David, attacked USS New Ironsides using a spar torpedo. The Union ship was barely damaged, and the resulting geyser of water put out the fires in the submarine's boiler, rendering the submarine immobile. Another submarine, CSS H.L. Hunley, was designed to dive and surface, but ultimately did not work well and sank on 5 occasions during trials. In action against USS Housatonic, the submarine successfully sank its target, but was lost by the same explosion.
The Confederates operated a number of commerce raiders and blockade runners, CSS Alabama being the most famous, and British investors built small, fast blockade runners that traded arms and luxuries brought in from Bermuda, Cuba, and the Bahamas in return for high-priced cotton and tobacco. When the Union Navy seized a blockade runner, the ship and cargo were sold and the proceeds given to the Navy sailors. The captured crewmen were mostly British and they were simply released.
The blockade of the South caused the Southern economy to collapse during the war. Shortages of food and supplies were caused by the blockade, the failure of Southern railroads, the loss of control of the main rivers, and foraging by Union and Confederate armies. The standard of living fell, even as large-scale printing of paper money caused inflation and distrust of the currency. By 1864, the internal food distribution had broken down, leaving cities without enough food and causing food riots across the Confederacy. The Union victory at the Second Battle of Fort Fisher in January 1865 closed the last useful Southern port, virtually ending blockade running and hastening the end of the war.
Decline of the Navy, 1865 to 1882.
After the war, the Navy went into a period of decline. In 1864, the Navy had 51,500 men in uniform and almost 700 ships and about 60 Monitor-type coastal ironclads, which made the U.S. Navy the second largest in the world after the Royal Navy. However, Congress had little interest in maintaining a world-class Navy. During the war, it opposed building large ocean-going ironclads like USS Dunderberg, viewing them as unnecessary for national defense. By 1863, anticipating deep post-war budget cuts, the Navy developed a new doctrine. Congress favored a peacetime fleet only composed of coastal ironclads and ocean-going commerce destroyers, inspired by the Confederate commerce raiders. Under this doctrine, the ironclads would protect the American coast, while the commerce destroyers, the Contoocook, Guerriere, and Wampanoag classes, would target enemy merchant shipping and thus serve as an economic deterrent against European powers considering war. However, the commerce destroyers were laid down during wartime shortages of high-quality wood and were built with subpar material that forced them to be decommissioned only after a few years.
Over the next 2 decades, the Navy was starved of funding due to a larger national interest in developing the American West and an economic depression. By 1880, the Navy only had 48 ships in commission, 6,000 men, and the ships and shore facilities were decrepit, but Congress saw no need to spend money to improve them. In 1871, an expedition of 5 warships, commanded by Rear Admiral John Rodgers, was sent to Korea to obtain an apology for the murders of several shipwrecked American sailors and secure a treaty to protect shipwrecked foreigners in the future. After a small skirmish, Rodgers launched an amphibious assault of approximately 650 men on the forts protecting Seoul. Despite the capture of the forts, the Koreans refused to negotiate, and the expedition was forced to leave before the start of typhoon season. 9 sailors and 6 Marines received medals of honor for their acts of heroism during the Korean campaign, the first for actions in a foreign conflict.
By the 1870s, most of the ironclads from the Civil War were laid up in reserve, leaving the United States virtually without an ironclad fleet. When the Virginius affair first broke out in 1873, a Spanish ironclad happened to be anchored in New York Harbor, leading to the uncomfortable realization on the part of the U.S. Navy that it had no ship capable of defeating such a vessel. The Navy hastily issued contracts for the construction of 5 new ironclads and accelerated its existing repair program for several more. By the time the Garfield administration assumed office in 1881, the Navy's condition had deteriorated still further. A review conducted on behalf of the new Secretary of the Navy, William H. Hunt, found that of 140 vessels on the Navy's active list, only 52 were in an operational state, of which a mere 17 were iron-hulled ships, including 14 aging Civil War-era ironclads. Hunt recognized the necessity of modernizing the Navy and set up an informal advisory board to make recommendations. Also to be expected, morale was considerably down. Officers and sailors in foreign ports were all too aware that their old wooden ships would not survive long in the event of war. The limitations of the Monitor type effectively prevented the United States from projecting power overseas, and until the 1890s, the United States would have come off badly in a conflict with even Spain or the Latin American powers.
New Navy, 1882 to 1898. In 1882, on the recommendation of an advisory panel, the Navy Secretary, William H. Hunt, requested funds from Congress to construct modern ships. The request was rejected initially, but in 1883, Congress authorized the construction of 3 protected cruisers, USS Chicago, USS Boston, and USS Atlanta, and the dispatch vessel USS Dolphin, together known as the ABCD ships.
In 1885, two more protected cruisers, USS Charleston and USS Newark, which was the last American cruiser to be fitted with a sail rig, were authorized. Congress also authorized the construction of the first battleships in the Navy, USS Texas and USS Maine. The ABCD ships proved to be excellent vessels, and the three cruisers were organized into the Squadron of Evolution, popularly known as the White Squadron because of the color of the hulls, which was used to train a generation of officers and men. Before 1910, when an apprenticeship system was established, most enlisted sailors were foreign mercenaries who spoke little English.
Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660-1783, published in 1890, had momentous impact on major navies around the globe. In the United States, it justified expansion to both the government and the general public. With the closing of the frontier, geographical expansionists had to look outwards, to the Caribbean, to Hawaii, and the Pacific. And with the doctrine of manifest destiny as philosophical justification, many saw the Navy as an essential part of realizing that doctrine beyond the limits of the American continent. In 1890, Mahan's doctrine influenced Navy Secretary Benjamin F. Tracy to propose the United States start building no less than 200 ships of all types, but Congress rejected the proposal. Instead, the Navy Act of 1890 authorized building three battleships, USS Indiana, USS Massachusetts, and USS Oregon, followed by USS Iowa. By around the start of the 20th century, two Kearsarge-class battleships and three Illinois-class battleships were completed or under construction, which brought the U.S. Navy from 12th place in 1870 to 5th place among the world's navies.
Battle tactics, especially long-range gunnery, became a central concern. USS Puritan and the four Amphitrite-class monitors, originally ordered after the 1873 Virginia's War Scare, were completed in the 1880s and 1890s. They were followed by the USS Monterey and the Arkansas-class monitors. All of these vessels, except the Arkansas-class, would later take part in the Spanish-American War of 1898. The development of the modern torpedo in Europe between 1866 and 1890 would also lead the Navy to build 35 steam-powered torpedo boats between 1890 and 1901 for coastal defense.
Spanish-American War, 1898. Main article, Spanish-American War. The United States was interested in purchasing colonies from Spain, specifically Cuba, but Spain refused. Newspapers wrote stories, many which were fabricated, about atrocities committed in Spanish colonies which raised tensions between the two countries. A riot gave the United States an excuse to send Maine to Cuba, and the subsequent explosion of the ship in Havana Harbor increased popular support for war with Spain. The cause of the explosion was investigated by a board of inquiry, which in March 1898 came to the conclusion the explosion was caused by a sea mine, and there was pressure from the public to blame Spain for sinking the ship. However, later investigations pointed to an internal explosion in one of the magazines caused by heat from a fire in the adjacent coal bunker. Assistant Navy Secretary Teddy Roosevelt quietly positioned the Navy for attack before the Spanish-American War was declared in April 1898. The Asiatic Squadron, under the command of George Dewey, immediately left Hong Kong for the Philippines, attacking and decisively defeating the Spanish fleet in the Battle of Manila Bay. A few weeks later, the North Atlantic Squadron destroyed the majority of heavy Spanish naval units in the Caribbean in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. The Navy's experience in this war was encouraging, in that it had won, but also cautionary, in that the enemy had one of the weakest of the world's modern fleets. Also, the Manila Bay attack was extremely risky, in which the American ships could have incurred severe damage or run out of supplies, as they were 7,000 miles from the nearest American harbor. That would have a profound effect on Navy strategy and American foreign policy for the next several decades.
Rise of the modern Navy. 1898 to 1914. Main articles: Great White Fleet, History of the Panama Canal, and Big Stick Ideology. Fortunately for the new Navy, its most ardent political supporter, Theodore Roosevelt, became president in 1901. Under his administration, the Navy went from the 6th largest in the world to second only to the Royal Navy. Roosevelt's administration became involved in the politics of the Caribbean and Central America, with interventions in 1901, 1902, 1903, and 1906. At a speech in 1901, Roosevelt said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far," which was a cornerstone of diplomacy during his presidency.
Roosevelt believed that a U.S.-controlled canal across Central America was of vital strategic interest to the U.S. Navy because it would shorten travel times for ships between the two coasts. Reversing a decision to build a Nicaraguan canal, he purchased the failed French effort across the Isthmus of Panama. The isthmus was controlled by Colombia, and in early 1903, the Hay-Haran Treaty was signed by both nations to give control of the canal to the United States. After the Colombian Senate failed to ratify the treaty, Roosevelt implied to Panamanian rebels that if they revolted, the U.S. Navy would help their cause for independence. Panama proceeded to proclaim its independence on November 3, 1903, and USS Nashville impeded interference from Colombia. The victorious Panamanians gave the United States control of the Panama Canal Zone on February 23, 1904, for $10 million. The naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, was built in 1905 to protect the canal.
The latest technological innovation of the time, submarines, was developed in the state of New Jersey by John Philip Holland. His submarine, USS Holland, was commissioned into U.S. Navy service in fall 1900. The Russo-Japanese War of 1905 and the launching of HMS Dreadnought in the following year lent impetus to the construction program. At the end of 1907, Roosevelt had 16 new pre-Dreadnought battleships to make up his Great White Fleet, which he sent on a cruise around the world. While nominally peaceful and a valuable training exercise for the rapidly expanding Navy, it was also useful politically as a demonstration of United States power and capabilities. At every port, the politicians and naval officers of both potential allies and enemies were welcomed on board and given tours. The cruise had the desired effect, and American power was subsequently taken more seriously.
The voyage taught the Navy more fueling stations were needed around the world, and the strategic potential of the Panama Canal, which was completed in 1914. The Great White Fleet required almost 50 coaling ships, and during the cruise, most of the fleet's coal was purchased from the British, who could deny access to fuel during a military crisis, as they did with Russia during the Russo-Japanese War. The voyage taught the Navy more fueling stations were needed around the world, and the strategic potential of the Panama Canal, which was completed in 1914. The Great White Fleet required almost 50 coaling ships, and during the cruise, most of the fleet's coal was purchased from the British, who could deny access to fuel during a military crisis, as they did with Russia during the Russo-Japanese War.
A total of 55 Medals of Honor were awarded for acts of heroism at Veracruz, the largest number ever granted for a single action. Preparing for war, 1914 to 1917, despite U.S. declarations of neutrality and German accountability for its unrestricted submarine warfare, in 1915 the British passenger liner Lusitania was sunk, leading to calls for war, President Wilson forced the Germans to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare, and after long debate, Congress passed the Naval Act of 1916 that authorized a $500 million construction program over 3 years for 10 battleships, 6 battle cruisers, 10 scout cruisers, 50 destroyers, and 67 submarines. The idea was a balanced fleet, but in the event, destroyers were much more important because they had to handle submarines and convoys. By the end of the war, 273 destroyers had been ordered. Most were finished after World War I ended, but many served in World War II. There were few war plans beyond the defense of the main American harbors.
Navy Secretary Josephus Daniels, a pacifistic journalist, had built up the educational resources of the Navy and made its Naval War College an essential experience for would-be admirals. However, he alienated the officers' corps with his moralistic reforms: no wine in the officers' mess, no hazing at Annapolis, more chaplains and YMCAs. Ignoring the nation's strategic needs and disdaining the advice of its experts, Daniels suspended meetings of the Joint Army and Navy Board for 2 years because it was giving unwelcome advice. He chopped in half the General Board's recommendations for new ships, reduced the authority of officers in the Navy yards where ships were built and repaired, and ignored the administrative chaos in his department. Bradley Fisk, one of the most innovative admirals in American naval history, was Daniels' top aide in 1914. He recommended a reorganization that would prepare for war, but Daniels refused. Instead, he replaced Fisk in 1915 and brought in for the new post of Chief of Naval Operations an unknown captain, William S. Benson. Chosen for his compliance, Benson proved a wily bureaucrat who was more interested in preparing for an eventual showdown with Britain than an immediate one with Germany.
In 1915, Daniels set up the Naval Consulting Board, headed by Thomas Edison, to obtain the advice and expertise of leading scientists, engineers, and industrialists. It popularized technology, naval expansion, and military preparedness, and was well covered in the media. Daniels and Benson rejected proposals to send observers to Europe, leaving the Navy in the dark about the success of the German submarine campaign. Admiral William Sims charged after the war that in April 1917, only 10% of the Navy's warships were fully manned. The rest lacked 43% of their seamen. Only a third of the ships were fully ready. Light anti-submarine ships were few in number, as if no one had noticed the U-boat factor that had been the focus of foreign policy for 2 years. The Navy's only warfighting plan, the Black Plan, assumed the Royal Navy did not exist and that German battleships were moving freely about the Atlantic and the Caribbean and threatening the Panama Canal. His most recent biographer concludes that it is true that Daniels had not prepared the Navy for the war it would have to fight.
Fighting a World War, 1917-18. President Wilson ordered the United States Marine Corps enlisted strength increased on March 26th, and the United States Naval Academy class of 1917 graduated 3 months early on March 29th, before America entered the war in April 1917. Retired officers were recalled to active duty at shore station billets, freeing younger officers for sea duty. The Navy was given control of the Coast Guard and of the naval militia of 584 officers and 7,933 men who were assigned to Coast Patrol Service and the Naval Reserve Flying Corps. The Navy took possession of all United States radio stations and dismantled those in less useful locations to salvage equipment for military use. The Navy's role was mostly limited to convoy escort and troop transport and laying the North Sea mine barrage. The first United States military unit sent to Europe was the 1st Aeronautic Detachment of 7 naval officers and 122 enlisted men who arrived in France on June 5, 1917, to form the Northern Bombing Group. The United States Navy sent a battleship group to Scapa Flow to join with the British Grand Fleet, destroyers to Queenstown, Ireland, and submarines to help guard convoys. Several regiments of Marines were also dispatched to France. The first victory for the Navy in the war occurred on November 17, 1917, when USS Fanning and USS Nicholson sank the German U-boat U-58. During World War I, the Navy was the first branch of the United States Armed Forces to allow enlistment by women in a non-nursing capacity, as Yeoman F. The first woman to enlist in the U.S. Navy was Loretta Perfectus Walsh on March 17, 1917.
The Navy's vast wartime expansion was overseen by civilian officials, especially Assistant Secretary Franklin D. Roosevelt. In peacetime, the Navy confined all munitions that lacked civilian uses, including warships, naval guns, and shells, to Navy yards. The Navy yards expanded enormously and subcontracted the shells and explosives to chemical companies like DuPont and Hercules. Items available on the civilian market, such as food and uniforms, were always purchased from civilian contractors. Armor plate and airplanes were purchased on the market.